hello there. As said earlier, my name is Raido Kaju, and I am a software engineering manager at NIS. And first, somewhat of a disclaimer that we actually don't currently have the documentation live yet. So in that sense, the title might have been optimistic when I said it earlier. But nevertheless, we're working towards it, and we have a proof of concept that I can at least share with you today. And firstly, I would like to start out with the current X-Road documentation. And I've already heard mentioned here today that people already have found it and they find it very useful, which is really good. And it's currently hosted on our GitHub webpage along with the main source repository. And as you can see here, GitHub already actually does quite a good job in generating a presentable HTML web page of the documentation, and it generates the text forming, it generates links, and so forth. However, there are a few issues here, one being that if you want to switch between different versions, you need to somewhat know how the Git ecosystem works and how tags work, how branches work, and how to switch between them, and how to find the correct version that you're actually looking for. And in addition to that, localization is also a bit difficult. You can achieve it with folder hierarchy, but it isn't very convenient to use. So next, let's look at some of the goals that we set out for ourselves. And the first would, of course, be better usability. We want the user to be able to search the documentation, to be able to more easily find what they are looking for. We want it to be simpler to link to the documentation, whether it be for different localizations or different versions of the documentation, so that if it is an outside organization that's linking to our documentation, or even if we are linking to the documentation internally between different versions or localizations, then it would be better supported and it is easier to navigate between the different versions of the documentation. The second goal was that we currently have the documentation in GitHub, and it's already very usable, very useful. And we want people to still be able to find that documentation, and we want them to be able to go to our GitHub webpage and still use the documentation as they are accustomed to. But in addition to that, we also wanted to have this new framework that would give us maybe better control of the visuals and also provides us with better usability. And that means that we have to follow certain rules in the framework as well that's enforced by GitHub. Thirdly, here we have supporting multiple versions and languages, and this touches on the first point as well. But the idea is that we want to be able to display in the framework the current version and also the past versions that are still officially supported, and that they could easily be found. And also, as for the current version, it could easily be updated if there's some mistakes there or if there's additional documentation needed. And of course, one of the goals is also to provide access to the development documentation, so the so-called bleeding edge of the documentation. Once we start developing new features, that you can already build your own X-Road software and you can try the new features, and you also have some documentation that accommodates this. And in addition to that, of course, languages. We really would like that there would be multiple different versions or different localizations of the official documentation, and perhaps also instance-specific documentation that we'll discuss a bit later. And fourth, here we have open to contributions. So, of course, as the source code itself is open to contributions, we also want our members and our users to be able to contribute both the official documentation. We are especially interested in localizations, that since we currently only basically have the English version of the documentation, but we would like to see more localized versions of the official documentation for countries and different languages where X-Road is actively used. And in addition to that, we would like to have instance-specific documentation, at least perhaps linked or even somewhat documented alongside our official information. So this means the documentation for the Estonian or Finnish local instances of X-Road, Palveluväylä or XD, and then the operators could also add the documentation there, and if a person wants to use X-Road, they can find it all in one place. And finally here, of course, we want it to be continuously updated, so whether it's the current documentation for the current version, or if it's for the in-development version, we want it to be continuously updated and published to our websites so that we don't have a stale state compared to the GitHub repository. Next, let's look at some of the technical challenges that we faced. First of which is, of course, which framework to use. So there are different Markdown frameworks that you can use. There are some that are based on JavaScript, such as the ones I've listed here. But in addition to that, also in Golang and other statically generated websites. And from this list, we actually decided to choose Viewpress because, as hopefully many of you already know, with version 6.24, we released a new security server user interface, and that uses Vue as the front-end framework. So naturally, using Viewpress allows us to tap into the same ecosystem, and in addition to that, it also allows us to more easily create customizations for different components if we want to display something differently or if we want to customize anything in the documentation framework itself. Secondly here, as already mentioned, supporting both the GitHub-flavored Markdown as well as for the new framework. So the first thing there is actually linking. Viewpress handles generating anchor links a bit differently by default than what the GitHub documentation has or what the GitHub-flavored Markdown suggests. So this is something called a Slugify method that is used inside Viewpress, and we ended up creating a custom version of this function that would actually generate the same sort of anchor links as we are expecting in GitHub. And also here are the relative paths which are handled differently in Viewpress that uses Webpack to build the framework, and also in GitHub where it's a bit more relaxed. And finally here is the table of content that in Viewpress can be generated, but unfortunately in GitHub there's no easy way to automatically generate it. There are some external tools, but you can't add a special tag in your Markdown and have the table of content automatically be generated. So that's also a challenge. Thirdly, here we have generating multiple instances that work together, and this is a bit of a framework limitation at this point. Viewpress is great for generating one instance or one version of the documentation that has different localizations, but we found that it is a bit difficult to generate multiple different versions, so based on different tags and branches. So we actually ended up writing our own script that calls on the Viewpress build API and actually generates different localizations and versions based on the branches and tags that we have in GitHub, as well as the localization configurations. And next is, of course, the build process itself and how to publish it. Since we use Jenkins in our X-Road source code pipelines, it made sense to move forward with using that for our documentation publishing as well. So it sort of splits up the different parts of the generation process. We have Git polling on one hand that is handled by the actual Jenkins pipeline, which then calls the script that we have written. The script generates the documentation. The pipeline then handles publishing it to the correct places, and after which the cleanup is sort of a job for both, since the script knows a bit more about what it needs to clean up than Jenkins, but Jenkins does the final round. And finally here, it's validating the content during build, and unfortunately we don't have a good solution for this yet. We've tried some checkers that are in the Markdown ecosystem that Viewpress uses in the background. But unfortunately, they aren't comprehensive. They don't cover all the different linking cases, and they provide many false positives. So in the end, we decided to validate the end result, and that has worked out fairly well for us. Next, let's take a look at some of the non-technical challenges that we faced and are facing. Contributions, how do we handle those? The current idea is to possibly migrate the documentation from the source registry to a separate repository so that we could have more flexibility in our documentation, its branches, and its tagging. Then there's, of course, the question of CLAs. How do we handle those? What are the requirements there? And finally, the requirements on, as I've stated here, documenting how to document. So since we use the GitHub flavored Markdown, we have certain rules that need to be followed so that all the links work, all the images work, and so forth. Second, localizations. So one of the main questions here is, in addition to how to get the contributions in the first place, is how do we actually review these, since we don't speak all the different languages that we would like to support. We need to decide on some type of process, so maybe this could be a community member that can take responsibility of reviewing the specific localizations, and additionally how to support it in the framework so that we have a configuration file where actually the contributors can also localize the menu points and different framework related strings that need to be translated. Then thirdly, here we have the instance-specific documentation. This is what I mentioned before about the Estonian environment and the Finnish environment, and also other X-Road instances that might want their own documentation alongside ours. How will we handle those? How will we structure them? And again, who will be responsible so that the instance-specific documentation can be updated in a timely manner, and it can also be properly reviewed and sort of vetted before it goes to the official documentation. Next, we have the actual state of the current documentation, which, while is fairly good, it had some linking errors that we determined with our external tool, and maybe the bigger issue here is that it's not actually optimized for the web or keeping the web in mind. So the tables there aren't as responsive as they could be. If you want to view on a mobile device, you might need to scroll, and that's not very good usability for mobile viewing. And in addition to that, the images themselves are not optimized, so they could be compressed down without losing any actual quality. And this is also something that we would like to implement in the build process itself. And finally here, of course, hosting. Where do we host the documentation? Is it on GitHub pages? Do we host it on our own domains? Should we maybe host it on both? And then how to handle publishing to those and so forth. So those are the main challenges that we somewhat have faced, and also some that we still need to face before we actually publish the documentation officially. But next I'll show you a preview of what the current proof of concept looks like. So currently what we have running is this. It doesn't have any localizations at the moment, but as you can see, it has sort of better branding. It has the X-Road official colors. Then it has the automatically generated table of content on the left that follows you along. So if you're scrolling through the documentation, you can also move between the different headings more easily than you currently can. And of course, you have the search at the top there that allows for you to more easily find the documentation that you are looking for. You don't have to go through the index and go through the links to find what you're actually intending to read. You can use the search and find it in a more direct way. And next to that is the version selector. which shows the current and then the past versions. Then we would have the localization, but at the moment, the localization in the proof of concept is missing. We have the community link, we have a link to the NIS website, and of course a link to the X-Road source Git repository. And that's the current state of the proof of concept. We would still like to publish this officially this year, so goals 2020, but thank you for listening, and I welcome your questions.
Thank you, Raido. Okay, goals 2020. Yeah, we all had a few of those, didn't we? Yes.
Yep.
That's going well. Hope your goals are going better.
Well, so far better, but not achieved, as you can see.
Sure. So this proof of concept that you showed us, that's not in production yet. That's not the Viewpress stuff.
It's Viewpress stuff,
Yeah.
but it's technically it's in our S3 bucket and it's publicly viewable, but we haven't just sort of officially published it and given public access to it and all the nice DNS linking and so forth.
Sure. So it's there. Of course, you're an open organization, but it's not a secret or something like that. But you haven't said, hey, this is production. This is the one you got to look at.
Yeah. So it's not the final version that we are really completely happy with and that we would like to share with the world. So it's our in-house work in progress that we keep an eye on and then comment on.
Almost there. So you did speak about the challenges that you're facing and the few things you need to do before you can push this out and say this is it. What's the main one of those that you're working on right now, those challenges, or what's the most significant, I guess, or?
Well, currently for me, I've just sort of finished on the Jenkins pipeline. So my challenges so far have been mostly technical. For the initial release, we actually want to have the technical challenges solved so that we can publish it. And after that, we would like to move forward with most of the non-technical challenges about how to accept contributions and how to accept localizations and so forth. So agile, moving step by step.
Oh, he's got the buzzwords. Don't worry, guys. It's agile.
Course.
Everything's going to be great. Agile. It's modular. Look, could be blockchain. Who knows? Who knows?
Who knows?
Jokes. Who knows? Anything could happen there. Somebody asked here what was the timeline, but we already spoke of that. You're hoping to push it out by the end of the year, but
yes, I think at this point, perhaps the end of October, start of November, but we'll have to see.
Of course. And can you just talk a little bit extra about? You said you're going to be accepting submissions, user comments. How is the user community going to be incorporated in this new release with some sort of feedback, comments, additions mechanism?
Yes, the good part about Viewpress there is that they also have this component that you can actually, when you're on a web page in the documentation and you see something wrong, it directs you to our GitHub link for that documentation. You can do your changes and then you can send us a pull request. We're going to do the review and then, of course, pending CLAs and all the other non-technical challenges that we still have, we're hoping to accept the contributions then.
Okay, nice. Yeah, language is a difficult one, like you said, because someone could write in any weird language that nobody understands, like Estonian. So who would know, if you've got someone, because it was asked, for example, will this solution support languages, i.e. Japanese? Yamoto, is that you? I think, but how do you just hope there's members of the community can help with that?
Well, yes, on one hand that, and I guess we're also looking at if we can get some translations on our own to get the ball rolling, sort of. But mostly, yes, community contributions are very open. And as for the comment about different languages, I think that the official Viewpress language is, or the documentation is also in English. And I think it was Japanese. I might be mistaken, but it should support it just fine.
Okay, good. And one more comment, which is we already spoke earlier today, but any thoughts about putting a dark mode in there?
Well, I'm personally a big fan of dark mode, so if possible, I think dark mode is definitely something that we would add, but that's sort of also pending on our style guide. So once it supports dark mode, I don't see a reason why not to have it in the documentation as well.
Very good. Okay, we're going to wrap it up there. Raido, thank you very much, sir.
Thank you.